But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Welcome to episode 8 of the Exit Your Matrix show. Thanks for being here. So let's kick this off with someone I've quoted before, but I've only recently really read his works, and I continue to be blown away with what I'm seeing. A man is no less a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. Neither are a people any the less slaves because permitted periodically to choose new masters. What makes them slaves is the fact that they are and are always hereafter to be in the hands of men whose power over them is, and always is to be, absolute and irresponsible. I do want to spend a few minutes on this individual because his views, I think, are real game changers. They're so simple, so straightforward. In certain circles, you'll hear his name, but he's largely unknown, yet his arguments are really amazing. They are so logical, and they expose the absurdity of some of the things we think on some of the most important of topics. So let me give you a little background on Lysander Spooner. He was an American individualist, anarchist, abolitionist, entrepreneur, lawyer, essayist, legal theorist, pamphletist, popular philosopher, Unitarian, and writer. So had a lot of free time on his hands. He was a strong advocate of the labor movement and anti-authoritarian and individualist anarchist in his political views. One of the most interesting things about him is that he started the American Letter Mail Company. And so he basically went into competition with the U.S. Postal Service. So, of course, what did the post office do through the power of the government? It tied him up in all sorts of legal challenges and basically bankrupted him. So he had to give up the company. Not surprisingly, he was an abolitionist. But here is an interesting excerpt, if you'll indulge me for a second. As an individualist anarchist, Spooner advocated for pre-industrial living in communities of small property holders so that they could pursue life, liberty, happiness, and property in mutual honesty without ceding responsibility to a central government. Spooner felt that an expansive government created virtual slaves, and its demands of obedience expropriated the role of the individual. By letting the government make and enforce laws, Spooner contended that Americans, quote, have surrendered their liberties unreservedly, into the hands of the government. In addition to his extra-governmental post-service and views on abolitionism, Spooner wrote No Treason, in which he contends that the Constitution is neither a contract nor a text to which citizens are bound. Spooner argued that the National Congress should dissolve and let citizens rule themselves, as he had held that individuals should make their own fates. One final item. Spooner believed that it was beneficial for people to be self-employed so that they could enjoy the full benefits of their labor rather than having to share them with an employer. He argued that various forms of government intervention in the free market made it difficult for people to start their own businesses. For one, he believed that laws against high interest rates or usury prevented those with capital from extending credit because they could not be compensated for high risks of not being repaid. So today we're going to be delving into the last two of our 4 barriers to self-realization. Now recall that these are the things that prevent us from ascending in consciousness. They prevent us from understanding ourselves and being able to fully become one with our thoughts, emotions, and actions, and put those 3 together and in harmony. But before we get to that, this show is really about asking the question, and that question is something wrong? And when you objectively evaluate the condition of humanity that you see in the aggregate, how would you describe it? If nothing is wrong, or if there is something, is it just at the margins? Is it one of those things where we can allocate more money to education, or we can do a better job with homelessness and that'll take care of things? I suspect, though, that maybe you're here because you know something is wrong and that it's fundamental, it's essential. So when we face the issue of what it is this possible? As human beings, we are naturally receptive to stimuli that point us in the direction of involving third parties in the process of our existence. Think Little House on the Prairie and the average Western lifestyle today. And we convince ourselves we're making a rational decision by externalizing our responsibilities in exchange for comfort and perceived safety. And perhaps we do get those things in some degree, but what about the authority that comes along with it? And authority is such a pervasive issue and such a belief system. And if we acknowledge that there's a significant level of authority exercised in our existence, and if it's possible that authority may not be natural to how humans exist in their optimal environment, we have arrived at one of the most fundamental problems we face, because every one of the constructs, institutions, and systems we participate in or are members of have 2 things in common by their very nature: control and authority. So should we blame it on partisan politics? Oh, if they could just reach across the aisle. Or maybe the terrorists? Or should we blame even the banksters? Or Gates, or Soros, or Schwab, or BlackRock, or Russia, or the World Health Organization? And we can't forget about this one.
China. 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 China.
We can try to fool ourselves into shifting the blame to any number of demonstrably bad actors, but the truth of the matter just won't go away. Our actions and lack of action at the large-scale level across nations, continents, are entirely consistent with and are the primary cause of our current experience. Because there is a law of freedom, and it states that as aggregate morality increases, freedom increases. And as aggregate morality decreases, freedom decreases. Or, said another way, slavery increases. Having been in the process of this awakening for over 12 years, I can tell you that the information that I'm communicating to you is far different in perspective than anything you're probably used to and have heard before. It's hard, but extremely liberating when we can finally reach the point where we can say, I was wrong, and I don't know, and then observe the absurdity of some of the things we've built our entire lives around. The saddest part is that we only have ourselves to blame. Over centuries, we've taken the bait of handing over control of the most precious gift nature gives us, our own sovereignty, while at the same time ignoring voices over every human era warning us about the importance of our individual dominion, what wisdom really is, and how to develop intellectual self-defense. And over time, methodically, steadily, we find that we've divorced ourselves from practically everything that really makes us human. We're entirely disconnected from and largely ambivalent about the most important yet manipulated and misunderstood subjects, like our food. In most cases, we have a very limited knowledge of how to defend ourselves and our property. Largely, we're at the mercy of third parties for employment and have limited, even basic self-preservation skills. But this is the American dream, right? Get good grades so that you can get into a good college, so that you can get a good job, so that you can work your ass off and maybe, hopefully, have a few years where you're not too sick or tired to enjoy it. And the answer actually has very little to do with the usual suspects we hear about ad nauseum. Yes, these people in groups make my skin crawl, but they're just the contractors. They're the garbage men. The real action isn't anywhere out there. It's in an understanding of who we are, and not only how we achieve fulfillment and our positive aspects, but also how our natural proclivities, desires, tendencies, mindsets, even the barriers of self-realization that I'm talking about right now, they can all lead to our suffering. In short, our understanding of ourselves is by far our best intellectual and emotional self-defense. So in response to that question of something being wrong, and we know that there is something wrong, this show is really about an exploration of what our experience would be like if we lived in harmony with natural law principles and how it might affect the very issues that we're talking about. So as always, if you don't mind, hit that subscribe button, like, share, do something. Anything helps. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this to get this information out there because I think it's compelling and I think it really leads to a whole different type of awareness of what's going on around us. So we'll move on now and do a quick review. So we've talked about truth and solipsism and the fact that truth is belligerent by its very nature. Truth doesn't require any belief in it. It is simply the collection of laws of the universe and how those things play out in the real world over and over and over again. So I rarely come across the word solipsism or any derivation of it, but my wife was kind enough to get me a book for Father's Day that I'm really enjoying reading, and there was a section in it that I wanted to relay to you just to kind of put solipsism in some context. And the background here is the author is talking about myths and the importance of myths in a culture and a people's level of consciousness and kind of where they are mentally. We need good myths to help us to identify with our fellow human beings, and not just with those who belong to our ethnic, national, or ideological tribe. We need good myths that help us to realize the importance of compassion, which challenges and transcends our solipsistic and tribal egocentricity. And crucially, we need good myths that help us to venerate the earth as sacred once again, because unless there is a spiritual revolution that challenges the destructiveness of our technological genius, we will not save our planet. So I've given several derivations of the definition of truth on the show, and here's another one I think is pretty good. Truth is the ability to correctly interpret and understand our environment and condition. So it's actually the ability to rationally and reasonably evaluate what's going on in our experience around us and truthfully evaluate it and speak of it as it is, not with different symbology and different overlays of contexts and different traditions that we're taught. We've also talked about cause and effect, and arguably cause and effect is one of the macro themes here. It's one of the cornerstone items that we have to understand, that there are causes and there are effects in the world, and there may be a time lag between the cause and effect, but there's certainly there's a connection between the two. And we see this at the micro and the macro or the aggregate level. So I've commented before about coming across content, whether it's a quote or a podcast or a video, just as I needed it for a particular show. And here we have another example. So my friend David and I, who I've mentioned before, we just got into the first chapter on Pythagoras as we're going through Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Hall. Now, I've heard of Pythagoras, we all have, right? But it's always been limited to knowledge about mathematics and geometry, at least my understanding was. And so I won't belabor this, but he's an absolutely fascinating character, and I can assure you his writings, his teachings, his philosophies about things goes far beyond mathematics. I can tell you that for certain. And I've just scratched the surface, but I think David was right. He made a comment, and he said that what gives Pythagoras such an interesting twist in the story and makes him so compelling, really, is that he's a verifiable person. And unlike Hermes, who we talked about before, where the contributions were also mind-blowing, but the thinking seems to be that Hermes was a synthesis of multiple contributors, but Pythagoras was his own person, one individual. So let's get Manly Hall's views on what Pythagoras believed about causes. Pythagoras believed that relationships were essentially mental rather than physical, and that a stranger of sympathetic intellect was closer to him than a blood relation whose viewpoint was at variance with his own. Pythagoras defined knowledge as the fruitage of mental accumulation. He believed that it would be obtained in many ways, but principally through observation. Wisdom was the understanding of the source or cause of all things, and this could be secured only by raising the intellect to a point where it intuitively cognized the indivisible manifested outwardly through the visible, and thus became capable of bringing itself in rapport with the spirit of things rather than with their forms. And we've covered aspects of manifested consciousness, and that's the trinity of thought, emotions, and actions that makes up our consciousness. Most importantly is harmony, and how critical harmony among these three aspects is, because if we are thinking, and that is, our thinking is colluding against or is in opposition to these other components, or we have one or any of these working against one another or not in harmony, we are going to be conflicted and we're going to be broken people. We're not going to understand really how we are supposed to be going about life unless we really do have these three parts of ourselves in line. We've discussed brain structure and composition. So we have a triune brain with the reptilian or the brainstem at the base. And this, of course, is responsible for survival instincts, fight or flight, you'll hear. And I've also heard fight, flight, or freeze, which I think is probably a pretty good addition. Next, we have the mammalian brain, which sits on top of the reptilian brain. And the mammalian brain introduces the aspect of emotion into our psyche. And then finally, we have the neocortex, or the human or thinking brain. And again, this is where we can actually do meta-thinking, we can think about thinking, we can engage in philosophy and all of these other very complex topics and subjects. We've covered the left and right brain, and again, in balance, just as with the triune brain. If we have someone who is, and many people now, it's showing studies, people are suffering from this kind of serotonin overload, where they are often working from the reptilian brain, and we're seeing so much pushed at us that is fear-driven and has certain reactors associated with it. I guess I call it that. That seems to operate to get us to respond in a certain way, and usually very viscerally, fight or flight, a very high-level emotionally charged response that oftentimes just is absolutely not warranted from the circumstances. So again, we have to have these elements of the triune brain just as we have to have the elements of the left and right brain in balance for them to work properly. We have the two primal forces within us, and these are love and fear. Love expands consciousness, and fear constricts consciousness. And when we experience love internally, we call that sovereignty or dominion. And when experienced or seen externally, we call that freedom. Conversely, if we experience fear internally, we call that confusion. And fear externally is in the form of slavery. Fairly recently, we also discussed some troubling worldviews that can result from left or right brain imbalances. So if we have an imbalance, chronic imbalance to the left brain, that can result in a condition called randomness, and that is essentially the belief that the universe operates with no laws and with no order. Everything is simply, as the name implies, random. And this can give way to an order giver and master mindset. That can continue and evolve into social Darwinism and practices like eugenics. And then if we have a chronic imbalance to the right brain, the worldview that can result is determinism. And this is essentially the opposite, in which there is complete order, or entirely everything is ordered and preordained. Everything is playing out according to a script that's already been written. And this is very much akin to and in line with an order follower or slave mindset. And if we see this extensively, and we do see it, in religious extremism and fundamentalism. So we do have to keep in mind that we will see these mindsets or worldviews of randomness and free will, but we don't see them in the natural world as mindsets. We see them, for example, with randomness in free will. So each of us has free will, and that's where we see random events take place, because until an individual decides and exercises his or her own free will, we don't see that manifest in reality. And then we see determinism in natural law, because it is the most universal and the ultimate set of laws that governs human existence and our behavior and our relationships and the outcomes of our actions. And the last concept we covered was magic and sorcery, these being the art and science of influencing thought and behavior which creates change in our experience. And magic is an individual's choice to live in harmony with natural law, or capital W will. And sorcery is a person's choice to live in conflict with natural law, and basically in an ego state, which is the lowercase will. These lead to either order or chaos, and understanding how they are created in the world is called natural law. This is not how things simply happen randomly with no ability to clearly understand the relationship between cause and effect, which we can. This creates order, and that's based on love, which is the expansion and awakening of consciousness, and brain balance. What creates chaos has its roots in the contradiction of consciousness, fear, and the external control of others. That brings us to our current topic, the barriers to self-realization. In the last episode, we covered the first two, which were the five-sense illusion and ego identification. As a quick recap, the five-sense illusion is a deeply left brain phenomenon where we have strong attachment to the material world, the world of matter, and we do so to the detriment of the spiritual and emotional nature of the right brain. It's the inability to understand what we experience as the construct. It's the language, to use a different word, for the experience, not the experience itself. The great David Icke explains it like this.
So, our point of attention holds us in this reality unless we're open to consciousness. Because what happens is if you come into this reality, this visible light reality, and you hold that connection to consciousness beyond this reality, you have everything you need. You have the information coming through the senses to give you a fix on what's happening around you, but you have the big picture that's outside of this reality, that's not programmed by its perceptions and its sense of limitation, which can then feed you insight, inspiration, intuition, to give you insight beyond that which you are directly experiencing. But you get disconnected from that, big problem. You're now trying to get your entire fix on reality from the reality you are in. And if a network controls that reality and that information that's coming at you, they are going to program your sense of reality for life. What time is Simon Cowell on? All that stuff. So, most people, and it is changing, hallelujah, brother and sister, but it's still the vast majority are caught in the program which they think is real and they think is all there is to see. And so in this world, there are people in the program who are only getting that sense of reality, and then there are people who've opened their minds and opened their hearts, come to that big time, who are accessing another sense of reality, and these people call these people mad and crazy and dangerous. Yes, they are. They're dangerous to the prevailing program.
Next is ego identification, and in the simplest form, this is the view of ourselves as the roles we play. We find it in the rote response practically everyone gives when we introduce ourselves, right? Well, I'm a fill in the blank. Doctor, lawyer, mother, teacher, insurance broker. But these are experiences, not who we are. This cult-like thinking and our attachment to roles grows to a point where we're no longer able to say, I was wrong, and then it's a very difficult process to undo. Let me wrap up that review with a plea to make a very smart move and order the amazing repository of knowledge, or ARC drive. This is a 2 terabyte drive that you'll get back from Mark Passio with data on it that I guarantee will expose you to new and extremely valuable information. And there are probably things in there, single-handedly, videos, books, audio files, that by themselves I think could really change a person's mind on a lot of different things. It's that powerful. So I highly recommend that you do that. If you do, one thing that I would ask is, just since I'm sending him your way, please read the instructions, follow the instructions. He churns these things out. I think he said that he is doing them constantly, daily. So just help him out by going through the process and doing it the way he asked you to do it. So today we delve into the final 2 barriers to self-realization: the prison of the left brain and institutionalized belief systems. The third of our barriers to self-realization, the prison of the left brain, is characterized by an intense association with things, with stuff. Its obsession with materiality. The left brain operates to properly allow us to function in the world, to decode the signals we receive from our senses. We wouldn't be able to engage in linear thinking, to perform functions like talking, walking, and various motor skills that create the marriage of thought and emotion that we can then act upon. In the process, we ignore and undermine the critical contribution of the right brain and its sacred feminine qualities of true care and intuition. The right brain then begins to malfunction and shut down, resulting in our diminished ability to feel emotions. So emotions function as our moral guidance system, which gives us feedback on whether we're doing what we should be doing. When the right brain is constantly in communication with the neocortex, it uses data to make judgments, in other words, deciding what action it should initiate. There are many causes of falling into this mode, but they can be generalized as this. It happens through what we take into ourselves. So, as an example, physical matter, food, what's our diet, how is our nutrition, and information. These are all the sources of data that come to us and that we go to for data. Recall that I've discussed before the importance of discretion. So Manly Hall uses the word discrimination instead of discretion, but I think he uses it very similarly. And here's what he has to say about exercising it in his discussion of the golden verses of Pythagoras.
The individual who can perceive the good, though he may not yet practice it, who has this discrimination within in himself, to honor first that which is most honorable, to venerate first that which is most venerable, will through these procedures come to recognize the importance and dignity of good things. If we give our lives cheerfully and our hearts and minds gladly to those things which are best, if within ourselves we gradually develop a code in which we honor, respect, and revere those qualities which are most eternal, most worthy of our general and continuing admiration, then we are constantly presenting ourselves with good ideas. We are constantly reminding ourselves of the importance of the life of virtue as the pathway leading to the attainment of truth.
So when we are following our moral compass and the brain hemispheres are in balance, we allow the mammalian brain, the emotional brain, to engage in its proper role as a guide, a contributor to the decision-making processes. Public and non-religious private schools won't touch anything of a non-physical nature, and private religious schools teach dogma, which is simply a prescribed set of beliefs that are to be accepted on faith and not questioned. Neither of these is true spirituality nor philosophy. In both cases, they are conveyances of prepackaged beliefs and in no way could ever be viewed as a real acquisition of knowledge. And look this up, but the American schooling system is squarely based on the Prussian system, which was put in place after Prussia lost the Battle of Jena to Napoleon in 1806. And here's a very basic summary. Facing oncoming conflict, so you have these Prussian soldiers looking across and seeing the enemy, they had the audacity to make up their own minds about whether they wanted to go forward and go into battle or go back to their homes and their wives and their children and their families. So they went home in sufficient numbers that the Prussian army lost that battle. Now, Prussian decision makers quickly concluded that the outcome was unacceptable, and after significant research, they determined that compulsory public education was the best way to instill compliance. And that's very similar to what we have today with the bells, the alarms, the lines, the rigid schedules, and so on. The popular term for education, or what I really think is better termed schooling today, is outcome-based. And all this means is that it's a view holding that the process of education, the acquisition of information and our attention to it through questioning, comparison to our experience, seeking of input from those with wisdom, and so on, has no value. It is only when a tangible outcome, mostly in the form of income earning potential, in other words, employment, can be realized that we regard it as having value. And if we take much of a look at all at the average Western existence, it's clear that it's dominated by left brain engagement and activities. The brain senses the imbalance and seeks relief, the emotional element, through the right brain engagement, which plays out as passivity and creates the perfect condition for propaganda to flourish. This process creates controllers, order givers, masters, and where there are order givers, there is the more worrisome group, the controlled, the order followers, the slaves. The fuel for the systems we have is sufficient numbers of order givers and order followers. These institutions are artificial constructs that never exist in nature and don't resemble anything natural, and they are all based upon faith and belief. The thinking is, it can't conceivably be any other way, and alternate solutions are never contemplated. So I'll give you an example, democracy. Controversial, perhaps? When have you heard a conversation around the soundness of the concept of democracy and a real inquiry into whether it is beneficial or detrimental to human beings? But why would you need to? When is there a missed opportunity for us to be told how fortunate we are to live in the greatest nation on earth, with the greatest system of government ever instituted, and with the most freedom of any other peoples on earth? But slaves are slaves, whether their every move is dictated or they have what may seem to be significant, but never complete, of course, sovereignty. And arguably the most widely held institutional belief is money. Recall the double slit experiment and the importance of observation. So money, including what may be called hard currency or precious metals, requires a belief in it to have value. Right, just like the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Another example is secret societies and occult organizations. They operate through the control and dissemination of information. And recall, the word occult means hidden. I would really think, with the intrigue around secret societies and how many members they have, that we would want to know more. That there would be natural curiosity about what the fuss was over and why all the secrecy. Isn't wanting to acquire that very type of knowledge consistent with desiring sovereignty and freedom, since it can give us the critical information that is important to understand who we are, and thus the most potent defense against a potential threat to that very sovereignty and freedom? And oh boy, here's one that is probably going to make me very unpopular. But truth is truth. The institutions of law enforcement and the military are the poster children for order giver and order follower behavior. Those behaviors are both rewarded and demanded in those systems. Some of the most compelling and I believe honest comments and remarks on this subject come from Mark Passio.
This brings us to the issue of moral culpability when it comes to order followers. The question always arises, who's more morally culpable? Where does the real responsibility or blame lie? In the order giver or with the order follower? Moral culpability is the determination of who is ultimately at fault or deserving of blame for the commission of actions which result in harm or loss to other beings. Culpable as a word comes from Latin, culpa, meaning blame, and the word culpable in English means at fault or deserving of blame. There is such a thing as blame. There is such a thing as who is at fault, who brought that resultant harm into manifestation in reality. So who is more morally culpable? And please read the question specifically. Who is more morally culpable? The painful truth, the order follower always bears more moral culpability than the order giver, because the order follower is the one who actually performed the action, and in taking such action, actually brought the resultant harm into physical manifestation. Order following is the pathway to every form of evil and chaos in our world. It should never be seen as a virtue by anyone who considers themselves a moral human being. Order followers have ultimately been personally responsible and morally culpable for every form of slavery and every single totalitarian regime that has ever existed upon the face of this planet.
Those with an attachment to the belief in law enforcement and the military believe that we are incapable of conceiving a new way of realizing the ideal of justice outside of and significantly different from the current system. Now contrast justice with what we have now, which is law enforcement. And they are most definitely not the same thing. So this group believes that security of the nation's territory and citizens requires and justifies a mechanism where almost 3 million human beings, which is the approximate count of all those in one branch of the military or another and in law enforcement, where it takes those 3 million human beings and by design strips them of their natural gift of free will and reduces them either, or in some cases puts them in both of these categories of an order giver and or an order follower, a master and or a slave. And then there's one of my all-time favorites, politics. Even in the truth and freedom movement, this is a major trap that so many can't find their way out of. That the working of the same political system that exerts a heavy influence on what we experience day in and day out is the same system that can somehow save us from it. It's amazing. One of my favorites is James Corbett of the Corbett Report, and he did a great piece called Hopium. Here are some highlights.
Deus ex machina, or God from the machine, refers to a plot device whereby the hero of a story is saved from some terrible fate by the sudden intervention of a god. The term comes from ancient Greek drama, where the god would literally be brought onto the stage using a machine like a crane or a riser. 2,500 years ago, that something was a god. But in the modern world, we're too sophisticated to believe that a god will swoop in and save the day. No, today, the Deus ex machina isn't a god. more often than not, it's a politician. Every election cycle, the public hears how this politician will deliver the nation from its economic woes, or that politician will restore a country to its former greatness. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected as President of the United States on the back of his popular campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." Just 5 months after his re-election, he oversaw U.S. entry into the First World War and gave his now famous speech assuring the public that getting the U.S. into war was necessary to make the world safe for democracy. Similarly, Lyndon B. Johnson won election in 1964, promising to limit America's involvement in Vietnam.
Some others are eager to enlarge the conflict. They call upon us to supply American boys to do the job that Asian boys should do.
But this, too, was just another swiftly broken promise by yet another political savior.
Air action is now in execution against gunboats and certain supporting facilities in North Vietnam.
But this pattern is not just about war, and it is not specific to any particular country. Throughout the world, politicians have won elections promising to deliver the inherently undeliverable. What Australian could forget Bob Hawke's promise to eliminate child poverty in 3 years?
By 1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty.
In fact, with all these decades and, in the case of the oldest democracies, centuries of broken political promises, you'd think that the public would have caught on to the game by now. But, if anything, recent events have revealed that people are becoming more addicted to this politician-peddled hopium, even as the lies and broken promises become ever more ridiculous.
I will provide our intelligence and law enforcement agencies with the tools they need to track and take out the terrorists without undermining our Constitution and our freedom. That means no more illegal wiretapping of American citizens.
I came in with a healthy skepticism about these programs. My team evaluated them. We scrubbed them thoroughly. We actually expanded some of the oversight, increased some of the safeguards. But my assessment and my team's assessment was that they help us prevent terrorist attacks.
Like all the iterations of the President Messiah script that came before, Trump's Make America Great Again psychodrama was already having its intended effect on the population. In some ways, MAGA was a mere repeat of the Obama Hope and Change template. Here, too, candidate Trump promised the moon that President Trump steadfastly failed to deliver. He did not drain the swamp.
And we are going to drain the swamp of corruption in Washington, D.C. We're here to celebrate the swearing in of America's new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. We are going to drain the swamp.
President-elect Trump has named the former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani to lend his expertise on cybersecurity.
It is time to drain the swamp.
Gina is tough. She is strong. And when it comes to defending America, Gina will never, ever back down. I know her.
He did not end the wars.
And look at the mess we have. We've destabilized the Middle East, and it's a mess. A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? The consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable.
He did not stand up to the medical-industrial complex.
Just the other day, 2 years old, 2.5 years old, a child, a beautiful child, went to have the vaccine and came back and a week later got a tremendous fever, got very, very sick, now is autistic. I hope we're going to have a vaccine and we're going to fast track it like you've never seen before.
Just like Obama, Bush, Clinton, and every other political savior of the modern era, Trump broke his promises at will, knowing, as a reality TV star who had long shown himself to be a consummate performer, that governing was not his real role in this stage play. He had come to entertain the audience and save the country, not deliver on promises.
And of course, there's theological religion as opposed to other forms of religion. This takes the form of frighteningly influential institutions holding as dogma that human beings are incapable of a direct spiritual experience, and representatives of those institutions are required as intermediaries.
My congregation is the world. I need the plane. I really believe that if Jesus was physically on the earth today, he wouldn't be riding a donkey. So for you that don't think I should have that plane, God told me to have that plane.
Are you seeing this? I hope so. You bought it.
This dope-filled world, and get in a long tube with a bunch of demons.
Right. That's exactly the
And it's deadly.
We caught up with Reverend Copeland in Branson, Missouri.
You said that you don't like to fly commercial because you don't want to get into a tube with a bunch of demons. Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did.
See the mighty power of our Lord and Savior flowing through the Kelvin Gemstone God Squad.
Florida Cody, everybody!
Let's give it up for the baddest, strongest behemoth on my squad, Torsten! He is a devout Christian.
So there we have it. The 4 barriers to self-realization. They are the primary reasons we fail to actualize our ultimate purpose, to understand ourselves, to ascend in consciousness. These are the systems and mindsets we come to build our identities around. They're constructs of belief that we usually have never done any first-hand exploration of because they're almost always imprinted on us, and no doubt from people who care for and want the best for us. But that doesn't change how dangerous the thinking, or lack of it, is. So we spent these last 8 episodes laying down a foundation of knowledge, and it's really exciting because we've gotten here and we're now going to be able to begin a phase of moving into meatier topics. And that process will continue as we become more comfortable with the newer concepts on this journey. I do want to leave you with something to think about. The belief systems, mindsets, impulses, etc., that act to move us away from truth are forms of mind control. I know that's a strong word, but let's hear what Mark Passio says about the relationship between mind control and something I have emphasized so much, and that is imagination.
Everyone that subscribes to an institutionalized belief system in some form or another, or to some degree or another, is under mind control. That's what keeps people believing that institutionalized belief systems, 1, are true, and 2, always must exist. That the world would just descend into utter, complete chaos and deterioration were these institutionalized systems taken out of existence, or they just completely dissolved. And that is the very definition of mind control. The very definition of mind control is the inability to use the imagination to envision anything different. That's the ultimate definition of mind control. Mind control is the extermination of the imagination, as simply as it can be put.
The ability to understand one's circumstances, to know the truth, and then to conceptualize, to conceive ideas of how things could be different, of contemplating what else is possible. We opened with a quote from him, so let's have Lysander Spooner take us out. A man's natural rights are his own, against the whole world, and any infringement of them is equally a crime, whether committed by one man or by millions, whether committed by one man calling himself a robber, or by millions calling themselves a government. Thanks for being here, and remember, always do your own thinking. Be well.